Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to whoever is joining us from Australia and from the United States. I welcome you all to the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association webinar today to launch the study on good food is vital for brain health so we can change the food industry. So this study has been published recently by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, and the report, you can find it on the website. Now, this webinar is organized in collaboration with the Brain Capital Alliance that we are promoter of, the Impact at Deakin Institute, so this is in Australia, the Food and Mood Center as well, the Baker Institute for Public Policy at the Rice University, and in collaboration with the OECD Neuroscience Inspired Policy Initiative. So during this session, we have a multidisciplinary expert who will present the main conclusion of this study and will discuss the novel solutions and policy options from the field of neuroscience, public health, economics, and policy. So the topic is very important today for economic policy, and in fact, food and nutrition and overall food security play a very important role in boosting brain health. In fact, according to the neuroscience research, and we have our colleagues that can share with us these main conclusions. Now, of course, the brain is a very complex part of the body. It requires a variety of carefully chosen nutrients to function properly. Of course, the diet is critical to achieve the optimal function via energy supply, antioxidant protection to avoid oxidative stress, hydration, and also specific vitamins and fatty acids to avoid cognitive decline. So in fact, the whole debate of the food, it's very important, in fact, because not only it's about quantity, but also is nowadays about quality and the quality of nutrients that everybody gets to develop the brain and also to ensure that brain is healthy. Now, heavily processed food that have entered our modern societies, aligned, of course, to enhance profit making by food companies, are proven to be detrimental to brain health. And I think that there is quite a wealth of evidence on it. The level of processing can be debatable, and this is something that we can discuss today, but there is also a need to carefully assess and regulate that level, especially, for example, the use of pesticide, the use of heavy processes of processing and all of that. Taking, of course, into account the detriment caused to the brain health and to health in general at all stages of the life cycle of human being. So today, I am honored to welcome an impressive lineup of panelists. We have 3 speakers and 3 discussants. So I'll start introducing them. Mr. Harris Iyer, who is a neuroscientist by training, so he has a PhD. He's a fellow in the Brain Health at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, senior fellow for Brain Capital with the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. He's also a member of our advisory board of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, and he's the co-lead of the Brain Capital Alliance. Thank you very much, Harris, to be with us today. And he's in Barcelona, by the way. We have Professor Felice Jaca. Felice, she's an Alfred Deakin Professor of Nutritional Psychiatry and co-director of the Food and Mood Center at Deakin University. And she's the founder of the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research. And she has published widely in the topic of nutrition, food, psychiatry, etc. We also would like to welcome Professor Susan Dickinson. She's a president of European Brain Council. Susan, she's a neurobiologist, and she's a professor of neuroendocrinology at the University of Gothenburg. She's also the secretary and executive board member of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and also chair of ECNP workshop for early career scientists in Europe. And she has been also the founder and co-chair of the ECNP Nutrition Network and EBRA brain food cluster. So she has a great experience in this topic. Now, our discussant, Professor Michael Burke, he is a director of the IMPACT, the Institute for Mental Health, Physical Health and Clinical Translation at Deakin University. Professor Michael Burke is currently NHMRC Senior Principal Research Fellow, and is Alfred Deakin Chair of Psychiatry at the Deakin University, and also Baron Health. So he has published over 1,400 papers and articles, and he is listed by Thomson Reuters ICI as high cited between 2015 and 2022. And also Michael has been been awarded over $144 million in grant funding to develop research and implement research on novel therapies. So we have really a great opportunity to hear Michael today on this extremely important topic. Also, we have Professor Mohammed Salama. He is Associate Professor at the Institute of Global Health and Human Ecology at the American University of Cairo, Egypt. And also, he is a Senior Atlantic Fellow at the Global Brain Health Institute. Welcome, Mohammed, to this webinar. And William Heinz, our colleague, he's the Senior Advisor to the Secretary General and Head of the New Approaches to Economic Challenges unit, which provide, in fact, the space to question traditional economic ideas and offer new economic narratives, new tools, methods, and policy approaches. And with William and Harris, we've been working on this neuroscience policy initiative. And this is one of the new approaches to economic policy that we are trying to develop and discuss also today. So as you can see, we have quite an impressive panelist today, and I'm very happy to moderate it. So let me say a few words about the logistics. This webinar content and discussions are public and are live broadcasted on YouTube and Facebook. EMEA team will later on publish a recording of the webinar and a report that summarizes the main discussion points. So if you have any questions by the participants to this webinar, please write your questions on the Q&A and I will share them with the panelists. So let us start, and I would like to give right away the floor to Harris, please.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rim, for that introduction, and thank you for hosting this event today. And thank you to all my other co-panelists, co-speakers. Let me bring up my slides. Okay, brilliant. So I'll be the first speaker today, providing context on more of the brain capital side of this report. So I'm very eager to share with you why we think that optimizing food and nutrition is important to building global brain capital, and why we ultimately think it's really important for the economy, for societies as well. So this is the report that was published just a few days ago by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, where I'm a fellow. And it's been wonderful to see some media pickup already of this report, as you can see down below there. I think suffice to say that we probably today will be skimming just the wave tops of this report. The report is very detailed. So if you're interested in this topic and to dive deeper, then please just find the report. You can Google it and you can read through it at your leisure. So we have a number of global brain challenges. On the left, I've lined up the clinical brain challenges that we know are very pervasive and cost trillions to the global economy every year: depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's disease. But on the right-hand side, we have these sort of non-clinical brain challenges, but certainly they are legitimate brain challenges. These things, many we will talk about in detail today, from ultra-processed foods, and Felice and Suzanne will talk more about that, poor diet, mis and disinformation, particularly around commercial milk formulas that could replace breastfeeding, is subject to significant amount of overhype, you could say. And there was a recent Lancet special issue about this issue for a commercial milk formula. Toxins in food and packaging is another important area. It's basically the effect of plastics in particular, and how plastics are breaking down from our food packaging into the environment. And we have now nanoplastic particles on the top of Mount Everest, on the bottom of the Marianas Trench in the deepest depths of the ocean, and actually now in women's breast milk. And every week now, we're learning more about exactly how these nanoparticles we ingest them, and how they can kind of slip through our blood-brain barrier and actually into our brains. And we need to learn more about that. And there are other non-clinical brain challenges like air pollution and climate extremes as well. And one of the things that we argue in this report is that the industrialized food system is actually significantly responsible for climate harms and greenhouse gas emissions and other forms of environmental destruction. So this is a very integrated concept. So as you can see, there's a lot of challenges we see to our brains, and we really need to have a coordinated approach to tackling these issues. And that's one of the things that we're very passionate to do with Brain Capital, to use that as an instrument to try to coordinate effective action. This is Brain Capital as a model. Brain Capital includes brain health, and then it also includes brain skills which are critical in the modern economy. And there are things that boost brain capital and things that impede brain capital. So this is very much economic construct. We want to think about now how brain capital should be a key pillar of the modern economy, sitting alongside other forms of capital like roads and bridges, infrastructure, nature capital, etc. We really do think that brain capital should be seen as a pillar of the modern economy, because if it's not thought about, then we have obviously tremendous issues and insults to our brain that aren't being dealt with in a coordinated way by policymakers and policy strategists. Brain health is an interesting construct because it doesn't just look at deficits. It doesn't just look at how depressed are you, how cognitively impaired are you. It also looks at positive attributes from the brain. How resilient are you? How creative are you? And brain health is obviously also a preventative construct. So if you're brain healthy, you can delay the onset of mental and neurological disorders. So this overview here is very helpful because it shows that brain health is relevant across the lifespan. And each one of you that's listening to this today sits on this spectrum somewhere. And you have family members and friends also on this spectrum, right? And they're doing either things that are negative, like in orange, or things that are positive in green. And we of course are arguing today that unhealthy diet is a negative, but of course healthy diet is a positive. And so this is an important vector for optimizing brain health through the role of food and nutrition. And as I said, brain capital includes brain health and brain skills. So it was nice to see the recent World Economic Forum report on the future of jobs just published last week. And it was demonstrating these types of skills here on the right that are critical for workers this year and in the coming years: analytical thinking, creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, and agility. These types of more, some really hard skills and sophisticated cognitive skills, but then also soft skills as well, right? Emotional intelligence, things like curiosity and lifelong learning. So this is really, to be able to enact these skills and to develop these skills, you need to have good brain health so that you can focus, learn, remember things, and get better on the job. So again, just demonstrating that brain capital is holistic and including not just health, but also skills is very important as we make brain capital a potent economic driver for change. It was nice to see that the Financial Times took our thinking here very seriously. They said that boosting brain health is key to a thriving economy. So this was wonderful sort of reinforcement from the FT. And of course, boosting the nation's brain capital and brain state can help people retool for the new economy, to upskill and reskill, and to unlock higher productivity growth. As I said before, the industrialized food system is significantly associated with the climate crisis. It's a key driver of the climate crisis. So a significant number of greenhouse gas emissions come from the global food system. This is related to deforestation, farming, transportation, processing and packaging, and waste. Of course, we should take a moment to say that the industrialized food system has been really important in the past. Industrialized food system has helped us to preserve foods for longer, to get food to hard to reach places where it's not possible to get fresh and healthy food to places. It's been important for fortification with important nutrients into the diet. So it has served a very important purpose. And indeed, in some parts of the world, particularly those that are hard to reach, it is still important. But we would argue that in many countries now, the industrialized food system is becoming much more detrimental and potentially, we would say, a net negative on society. But so it's just important to say that there is an important history and legacy of the industrialized food system that's been useful, but now we argue that it needs to be reformed, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So the climate crisis is mentioned. It's being driven by, excessive greenhouse gas emissions, etc., which is also driven by the industrialized food system. It's important because this also is a way that the industrialized food system, it doesn't just impact the brain by negative diet and the impacts of that on the brain, it's also the way that it's driving the climate dysfunction. So here's a nice visual that shows that actually weather extremes, severe cold, severe heat, poor air quality does have down the bottom there health risks for people. And we know that air pollution, for example, drives mental disorders and neurological disorders. It looks as if it's likely to speed the onset of Alzheimer's disease, for example. So again, this is a very integrated concepts here. We know that benefiting brain health is key to the economy. This is a wonderful overview from the American Association of Retired Persons. The paper was recently published in Nature Aging. On the left, you can see personal health behaviors, and on the right, how these behaviors can drive benefits at the population level. It's nice to see that eating right down the bottom left was noted. That leads to one of the drivers of healthy brain aging. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, that is associated with things like reduced healthcare costs, reduced economic costs, increased brain capital, etc. So a lot of what we try to do with brain capital and neuroscience-inspired policy is to try to link personal sort of micro behaviors to macro economic issues, because the personal micro behaviors of an entire nation state influence the entire economy of countries. So our report, just a couple of slides in conclusion here. The report has a lot of key recommendations. Here are just a few. We need to target ultra-processed foods in dietary guidelines and policies to say really that ultra-processed foods are really now a net negative. We need to think about restricting advertising of junk food to kids in particular. This is a form of manipulation, we would argue. We need to develop food assistance programs to promote healthy diets that have a lot of unprocessed or minimally processed whole foods. This is critical. We think that we need to have front of package labeling that warns against the health implications of ultra processed foods. This is an important sort of public health measure. Think about implementing zoning to limit the number of fast food outlets near medical and educational institutions like hospitals and schools. And we need policies to improve biodiversity and soil health by large-scale promotion and adoption of regenerative farming techniques. And this is one of the reasons why it's wonderful to work with EMEA and Rim and her team, is because we bring in the neuroscience into this discussion, but how do we nest this sort of neuroscience and brain stuff within new economics, regenerative economy? And I know that Carlos Cesar is on the line here, who's an eminent systems thinker and innovator who is thinking a lot about the regenerative economy. So how do we, again, get our thinking on brain and mind into mainstream economic and policy discussions. That's really important. So in conclusion, as the World Health Organization so aptly said, investing in building brain capital is fundamental to meeting modern societal challenges and to drive innovation. And we would argue in this report that good food and nutrition is critical to building brain capital. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has been a helpful introduction to the report, and I now hand it over to Rim and/or Felice to speak next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harris, for this good overview. I think you put really very much a focus on how industrialized food systems, they can also contribute to the climate crisis. And these are, in my view, dual challenges that we need to think of in terms of the first, how they contribute overall to the climate crisis. And I think this is a clear challenge that all policymakers they are working on. But beyond this, how this transfers to unhealthy populations. So in fact, more unhealthy populations will increase the cost on the social security and social protection. And this is really very dramatic if we look, for example, for the next few years, for the 20 or 30 years. And there is even an article in the FT saying that many industrialized countries will have their rates downgraded because the incapacity of these countries to honor their financial obligations, in fact. And I think this is also something quite important in terms of the financial aspect, whereby if no action is done today to ensure that these risks in terms of the climate change, but also from the excess or the consumption of processed food, or what you call extremely processed food, but I think all processed food will have to be rethought and ensure that what we eat and the food that is given to people is really not detrimental to them. So thank you very much for bringing this up and really making the link with the brain health and brain capital. And I would like to give the floor straight away to Felice. Felice, I think she is a prominent researcher on this field. She's running the Food for Mood Center in Australia. Please, Felice, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for inviting me to participate. And it's really wonderful being here in Barcelona with Rim and with Harris, and being able to, speak to people in person is always a wonderful thing. So I'm just going to share my screen and get this up here. And hopefully everybody can see this all right. So thank you again. I think it's very interesting, and it's been, I think, encouraging to me to recognise that there's a great deal of people are very receptive to this idea that the food system, the industrialised food system, really brings together a lot of the environmental challenges to brain health and biodiversity and challenges to the climate and the environment as well. So I'm just going to very briefly present my declarations. So I'll start off just briefly by explaining what is nutritional psychiatry. So nutritional psychiatry focuses on understanding the links between what we eat and our nutritional status and our mental and brain health across the life course. And what it, of course, does is it brings together a focus on the two leading causes of disease burden. So poor diets, largely driven by very profound changes to our global food consumption via the food industry and the industrialized food industry, now accounts for the leading cause of illness and early death via its impact on chronic disease. And at the same time, mental disorders, particularly the common mental disorders, depression and anxiety, they're highly prevalent. They represent a really massive burden of disease in countries across the world. And of course, they've only increased through the COVID crisis. What's important to understand when we think about mental disorders is that many of the risk factors are very hard to change. They're not necessarily modifiable. So things like genetics, early life trauma and stress, life stress, poverty and disadvantage, all of these things are challenging to modify. Whereas lifestyle behaviours such as diet are, of course, theoretically modifiable. So we now have a very extensive body of evidence from across the world, across countries and across cultures, to tell us that people who have a healthier diet, and here it could be a healthy dietary pattern in Norway or Japan or China, but basically foods that are less processed and have more plant foods and healthful fats and proteins, are associated with a 30 to 35% reduced risk in developing depression. And this is independent of things that we might think explain this association, things like education and income and body weight and other lifestyle behaviours. And we see this prospectively, so that when we take people who have not had any depressive illnesses and we follow them over time, we see that there's this independent contribution of diet quality to risk. And it's important to note that we have an emerging body of evidence from clinical trials showing that improving diet is highly efficacious and also highly cost-effective to treat even severe depression. So this is just one of the meta-analyses in the field, but there are several if people are interested in looking at that. And this one is also showing that even in people who have subclinical depression and anxiety, they also experience a benefit from dietary improvement. Importantly, we see this across the life course. So half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14. In this context, again, if we're thinking about prevention, it's incredibly important to focus on factors that are modifiable. And we see many, many, many studies showing that the quality of young people's diets, early adolescence, is linked to their mental health, very in a dose-response manner, independent of things like family functioning, family conflict, socioeconomic factors, and both things, not enough of the healthful foods that are full of the nutrients and fiber and phytochemicals, and also independently too much of these processed and ultra-processed foods, both linked to worse mental health. In Australia, and this is representative of many developed economies, young people eat on average about 7 serves of these discretionary foods or junk foods a day, which has a direct negative impact on their health, including brain health, but also displaces healthful foods that contain the macro and micronutrients and the phytonutrients that are so important. But going right back to the start of life, we see that early life exposures via pregnancy, mother's diets during pregnancy, are linked to both emotional health and neurodevelopmental outcomes. Now, again, diet is something that affects 100% of the population. It's modifiable. The association is not massive. The last thing we want is people to think, oh my goodness, I ate junk food during my pregnancy, my child's going to have a neurodevelopmental disorder. But it is very consistent. And I think it points very much to not making women feel guilty about their dietary choices, but rather the imperative to change the food environment such that healthful food becomes the default rather than the opposite that is true now, where ultra-processed foods are ubiquitous and heavily marketed and designed to be highly palatable. This is a study that I was involved in last year, very, very large Norwegian study where they have excellent data from registries showing that mothers' diets during pregnancy, this is their level of healthful food intake, this is their level of ultra-processed food intake, and then this is the children's diet quality linked to both ADHD symptoms and diagnoses. So again, this is a disorder that we've always thought to be very largely genetic, but we're seeing this relationship with dietary exposures in early life linking to neurodevelopmental outcomes. And the interesting part of this is the emerging interest in the gut microbiome and how this is involved, because the gut microbiome in very early infancy drives immune development, but we think from the emerging evidence that it's also involved in brain development. And of course, it's very much influenced by diet and mothers' diets. Infants, again, are not getting anywhere near enough the intake of the nutritionally rich foods and the fibre and the phytochemicals that are needed. In Australia, 99% of children don't achieve that national dietary guideline of intakes for vegetables. So this is not just a matter of poor education or income. This is something that's affecting the whole population, and it's because of the activities of the food industry and the heavily promoted foods and their ubiquity. Again, focusing on individual change is not pointless, but very challenging when you have the industrialized food environment where every indicator and every prompt is there for people to consume these foods. This is the United Nations Food Systems Summit 2021 report that actually calculated the cost of the industrialized food system, or our global food system, and estimated that it costs the globe roughly $20 trillion per year. Now, for context, $16 trillion per year is the whole GDP of China. 11 trillion of this cost is around the health impacts on chronic disease. Of course, they haven't actually integrated the data on mental health as yet, but there's another 7 trillion that relates to the environmental cost of the industrialized food system. So it's a truly massive cost that is not being reflected in the price of food. The ultra-processed foods, which we've made reference to a couple of times, these are classified according to the NOVA food classification system. And in some countries, we're starting to see specific warnings and also recommendations within the dietary guidelines to avoid these. But these ultra-processed foods basically are the industrialized foods where food originally and its components have been essentially taken apart, reconstituted. They tend to have many of the additives such as emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners, etc. But also, even when they have these nutrients, vitamins, minerals potentially added, or they have protein, fiber, macro and micronutrients, based on the emerging evidence, we don't think that the body and the brain recognize them in the same way as food, and they seem to have a particularly detrimental impact on health outcomes. If we look across, and these data are even slightly out of date now, because we know that in the USA, at least 60%, and in many areas of the USA, more than that, of people's daily energy intake is actually coming from these ultra-processed foods. Slightly less so in other jurisdictions, and in places where there's a strong food culture like Spain or Italy, you see less of input from ultra-processed foods, but it is growing. We know that it's associated with a wealth of different chronic disease outcomes, including an increase in the incidence of depression. This is a very good meta-analysis that we published a little while back. The other really interesting aspect to this, where I think it's critically important to understand, is when we think about biodiversity and biodiversity loss, and of course the food system being very much a major driver of biodiversity loss, it's not just the biodiversity of the environment that we need to worry about, but it's our own biodiversity via the microbes, the trillions of microbes that live on every part of our body that's exposed to the outer world, including the lungs and particularly the gut microbiome. We increasingly understand that this is playing a very important role in our health. We know that the industrial agricultural food systems, where food is commoditized and it's produced at mass scale, it results in farms being treated like factories. And it's resulted in an estimated 20 to 40% of the world's land degraded. And it's estimated that with intensive agriculture, the way things are at the moment, approximately 30% of the world's arable soil will become unusable for food production over the next century. So agriculture is responsible for 80% of deforestation, 70% of freshwater use globally. It's the biggest driver of terrestrial biodiversity loss. and contributes nearly 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So these monocultures that the industrialized food system relies upon have increasingly dominated the food system, and of more than 6,000 different plant species that the humans have cultivated for food, just 9 now contribute to about 66% of total crop production. And of course, monocultures use many pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and the intensive tilling through the current agricultural processes result in a loss of biodiversity in the soil, and that results in a loss of the nutrients in the foods we eat, because the microbes in the soil, the fungi, the bacteria, that communication that happens when food is growing in the soil is very disturbed when it's overly tilled and when you have the application of these pesticides, herbicides, etc. But it's actually those processes and that communication that contributes a lot of the nutritional value of food. So it's a major problem. I've just put this book up here because it's a very good one. It's written by some of the leaders in the science in this field. There's also some really interesting discussion about agroecology, which also considers, of course, the social and the cultural traditional landowners and farmers and how they need to be encompassed in conversations about how we change our agricultural practices. And this is another very nice paper if people are interested in this particular topic that's just been published. When we think about the ways in which diet might contribute to mental and brain health, they involve brain plasticity and neurogenesis, the immune system, mitochondrial function, epigenetic processes, stress response system, the tryptophan kynurenine metabolism, which contributes to central serotonin levels, and the gut microbiota. Now, all of these things are influenced by food, and each of these is involved in the pathogenesis of mental disorders. And we're particularly interested in the gut microbiota because that seems to link and involve all of these things, particularly the immune system. 70% of our immune cells are actually in our gut. And we know when we think about our food system and how diverse the microbes were and how diverse our food was, and how that's become increasingly less and less and less diverse. And this seems to associate with a very, very rapid increase in the incidence of allergic diseases, but also autoimmune diseases such as MS and type 1 diabetes. Antibiotics in the food chain are another very big part of this. More than 80% of antibiotics are actually used in livestock production. So we've lost biodiversity in our guts, we've lost biodiversity in the environment via these massive changes to the food system. We see when people move from traditional areas and traditional diets that they lose microbes, and that's associated with increased metabolic disease, etc. Our Food and Mood Centre program is very broad, from basic science and mechanisms right up to large-scale effectiveness trials, public health, education and training. If people are interested, they can go to the Food and Mood Centre website and see some of the many, many studies we're doing, including clinical trials and epidemiology. Our work's been represented in more than 100 high-level policy documents now around the world, including, for example, the new World Health Organization mental health report, which now lists unhealthy diet as a risk factor for mental disorders, which is very encouraging. I'm on the steering committee for the New Frontiers of Nutrition initiative that's been led by the World Economic Forum. And this is one of the forums in which the impact of the industrialized food system on health and biodiversity is really being captured and discussed. And the work we do is also really prominent in the media, but in the public's mind. And I think this is very encouraging, because to get policymakers to change, to get policymakers to listen, as well as to get industrialized food producers to listen, you need consumers to be driving the dialogue and starting to ask for these things. And because everybody eats and everyone has a brain, we find that this is a topic of great interest to the general public, which is very encouraging and useful. So here's a link to the Food and Mood Centre website if people are interested. We are unique in the world. We're the only research centre in the world that focuses on nutritional psychiatry, and particularly right across the life course. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Felice. This is really quite eye-opening, and I think this connection with psychiatry and nutrition is also a way to cut the silos between the topics, because up to now we only see things happening in silos, and this is not at all the response that we would like to see for the challenges that our economies and societies are facing, particularly climate change, and of course food. I would say nowadays we talk about food security, so this is really from a quantitative standpoint, so to ensure that everybody has access to food. But then we need to rethink that policy. In fact, everybody has to have access, but to good food, not to processed food, because in fact industrializing the food chain has been a kind of part of a model which is favoring say financial profit or profit in general, but then at the same time to reduce the time to for households, in fact, to spend time in preparing food and all of that, and all of this is creating, of course, or has been quite detrimental in terms of health. And your research, this is what is showing. So it's interesting nowadays to rethink the whole concept of industrialized food systems. Of course, this perhaps it's much more prominent in North America, less than eventually Europe, but something has to be done at this level. And also I wanted to raise your attention to one experience that I had in Africa, whereby the mining processes in different lands, using, for example, substances like mercury, can also interfere into the food chain. And we do not know the impact on health and on brain health particularly. So this is also an area, I do not know if there is research on specific psychiatry and neuroscience research on that, but I would be very interested to discuss this with you when you are when we are meeting. So this is really important in terms of what is the impact of the health impact of extractive industries, how the way they mine and how the way they extract on the overall food chain and on health in general. So thank you very much, Felice. And I would like to right away give the floor to Suzanne. Suzanne, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. It's great to join this very important event. I just share my screen. So as you've heard, I'm president of the European Brain Council. This is a pan-European organization which aims to drive advocacy and policy events, uniting many stakeholders across Europe. We're very keen to bring nutrition into the brain space and to reach out to those people that might be able to have impact. And my short presentation today, I really wanted to more address some of the issues that come up as we try to disseminate and communicate information to bring brain health, nutrition for brain health onto the EU agenda. I've been involved in two projects, which I'm going to tell you the results of, co-chaired by myself and Roger Adan. One of these is run by the European Brain Council, the EBRA project. It's the Brain Food Cluster. And this is more the policy and advocacy part of my presentation, also involved in stakeholder engagement, and also the nutrition network, which is really more the scientific part. You know, what are the challenges that we might face in moving towards nutrition for brain health? And we have two publications. The the ECNP Nutrition Network publication. This is more the science, you know, where are we? Where are we going with this? What can we do? And the second one is more of a policy document, which is more of aimed to inform those involved in policy decisions about the steps that need to be taken. So as you've heard, you know, brain health is a big problem. There's 165 million in Europe alone living with a brain disease. And in fact, about 1 in 3 people will suffer from a neurological or mental disorder at some point in their life. And treating brain conditions accounts for about 35% of the total disease burden. That's in Europe about 800 billion euros each year. And poor diet, the topic of today, is a major and one of the few modifiable risk factors for brain disorders. And in this context, I should mention that obesity itself, a consequence of overeating and unhealthy nutrition, is a risk for brain health. And as you've heard from Felice, nutrition impacts on brain health across the life course, and early intervention is very important. And here we're thinking of in utero, the mother, and also, of course, early nutrition for the baby. Governments, funders, food industry and society, none of us can do it alone. We've got to work together to tackle the issues. So what's the evidence that food impacts on brain health? And of course, we know about vitamin deficiencies, and this was maybe some of the earlier clues that we had, where serious disorders, including mental disorders, are impacted by deficiencies in vitamins, vitamin B12 being one of the classic ones. And also there's many reports from dietary interventions, for example, ketogenic diet or the Mediterranean diet, that they can have benefits in certain neurological and mental health disorders. We've heard from Felice today. Really, she's one of the world leading people in this field, and it's great that she's part of this symposium. And you know, they have studies looking at it in nutrition in relation to Alzheimer's disease and symptoms of depression. We can add to that things like folic acid during pregnancy can decrease the risk of autism. Elimination of food additives can reduce the symptoms of ADHD. And nutrition interacts with the immune system. And in fact, you could even make a direct link there to obesity, because in obesity, there's much inflammation, and we have lots of immune factors being impacted, which are important for brain health. So the problem, we have many problems in studying the impact of nutrition on brain health. I mean, things like the affinity, you know, vitamins were easily discovered because they're very potent. I mean, nutrition, nutrients, micronutrients, pollutants, you know, how do we discover their impact? Because they're acting very generally and are less directly potent. Which foods, you know, what are the essential micro and macronutrients? This is a key question and actually incredibly difficult to answer. And you have to look at this a bit systematically. Personalization, there are probably individual responses. Well, no, probably there are individual responses to diets. I mean, if I was to scan your blood after eating a banana and look at all the nutrients and the hormones and all the things that's going on in the blood, they vary a lot between us. And that's been shown, and there's much evidence base for this. And collecting data, we know that dietary assessments in human intervention studies are not easy. People are not reporting what they eat. So doing these kinds of studies requires not only honesty, but realization that people are really reporting what they eat. And sometimes we have to actually monitor that actively in human studies. Diversity. of foods. People are blaming macronutrients, don't eat carbs, don't eat fats. But actually that's misleading, and it leads us to the question of what truly is a healthy diet. There's a lot of misinformation. The field is polluted with claims and lack of scientific evidence. I mean, that's true of the popular press, but of course it's also true in science. People are overinterpreting the results of, for example, epidemiological studies. So these are very big population-based studies which show that across many people, those people who have a certain diet may have a better health outcome. But those people that are eating a healthy diet are probably exercising, they've probably got a healthy life in other ways, and we don't truly know often that it's the nutrients that are driving the health benefit. Nutrients are not drugs, and that's a key message from my talk today. So if you do the kinds of studies that you need in the pharmaceutical industry, randomized control trials, you can't adopt those kind of protocols for use in studies of nutrition. So nutrients also act via multiple mechanisms. And so, the big scope of brain, just diving into the brain and trying to find out how specific nutrients are acting is actually quite complicated. And this is something very important that I learned from discussions with Elaine van der Beek as part of the Brain Food Project. She works in Nestle, and she told us that the business models for the return on investment are very different within the food industry. It's much more difficult to have this return in the food industry than it is, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry. Specific nutrients cannot be commercially protected. So one company is developing a product, another company can just develop the same or similar product. It's not protected. The safety assessment of specific nutrients may need a similar investment. So while it can't be protected, you need to also assess their safety in the same way as the pharmaceutical industry. And then in the end of the day, you need an attractive food product that can be consumed regularly in order to provide the health benefit. So there is a role for the food industry in building the evidence base, but it can't act alone. And that's a key message. Harvesting the health and cost-saving potential of nutritional interventions to improve brain health is a public health issue, and that is impossible to address without public funding. In our policy paper, this is a figure from this paper, we're explaining that health food for all is a responsibility of policy and requires public funding. So we need to increase the scientific evidence. We need to identify nutrients that impact on brain health. And we need to identify the mechanisms. We need to delve into the brain, find out the pathways, the cells, the molecules linking nutrition with brain health. And we need to bridge the basic scientific mechanisms to clinical outcomes by identifying biomarkers, things that we can measure in the blood or in other ways to make this bridge. And then on the policy side, we need to generate effective messages concerning the role of food for brain health. So we need to implement dietary recommendations, for example, reformulation, food fortification, avoiding those things in the diet which are causing us, that are having detrimental effects for our health. We need to personalize nutrition and develop recommendations that take into account that we're all individual and at different life stages. It's not constant for a certain individual across the lifespan. And we absolutely need to improve nutritional education. We need it to be on the agenda of healthcare professionals and governmental bodies, and this involves policy activity at many levels. So in Brain Food, we have 4 projects, and the first one is to identify nutrients that impact on brain health. And here I'm more raising questions than answers. And these are tough. For which nutritional interventions is there enough evidence to justify big trials to determine their impact on brain health? And I add, who would do those trials? Should they be done in industry? As I've alluded, that's a bit unfair to put the cost burden on the industry, or should it be public? And how to utilize information from public databases and cohort collaboration initiatives to generate hypotheses on how nutrition impacts on brain health. We're very engaged in mechanism. I'm a basic scientist interested on how our food impacts on our brain health and identifying all those molecular pathways. So we need to know for which nutrients is there enough molecular and cellular mechanism provided to explain its effects on brain health. And we need to identify truly innovative approaches to understand the relationship between nutrients and brain health. And how does this mechanism influence stakeholders? We need to build up the evidence to convince them, to give them enough solid evidence to say, okay, it's time, we really do need to act and take food on the brain health agenda. This is a scientific slide, but it's got a very simple message. So you've got your food up here, and food, of course, we have all kinds of micronutrients. And just if we look at fats, proteins, carbohydrates, there's a mass of things in there, and they're detected in the gut. And then the gut takes up the nutrients and responds. I mean, this is a cell in the gut, and it will respond to this by changing hormones in our blood. So we have the nutrients themselves, but all the metabolites and all kinds of things in the blood that tell the brain information about what we've eaten. So the food we put in our mouth via the system and via the blood reaches our brain and has dramatic impact on brain function. So this is real, and there is much evidence supporting all of this. So then we have experimental medicine to explain the bottlenecks to perform experiments, the critical issues, feasibility. How feasible is it to do a clinical study exploring nutrition for brain health? You have regulators. I mean, when you do these clinical studies, you need to take into account the regulatory control by the FDA or by European regulators that you're going to be able to use essentially an experimental medicines approach to determine the efficacy of nutritional interventions to improve brain health. How can we engage stakeholders and make them realize how important it is even just to get funding for this kind of work? And we need to address differences between the additives, the nutrients and drugs from a regulatory perspective. And we actually need to be there linking the regulators to industry. And then implementation. We want to identify strategies to communicate the importance of nutrition for brain health to relevant stakeholders. Indeed, this event today is part of this implementation. What are the drivers and barriers to increase awareness of the importance of nutrition for brain health? And how can we link the stakeholders with a focus on policymakers, patients, public and society? So how do we move forward then? I mean, for advocacy, we would say that both public and relevant stakeholders need to receive the information that nutrition matters and needs to be prioritized at the EU level. And for policy, change is essential to improve brain health of citizens through nutrition. And then for our stakeholders, which are many and varied, they need to be educated and they need to receive the right information. And they need to receive plenty of it in all kinds of forms. So we need much dialogue with them and we need to collaborate with them. And we absolutely need increased research funding. This is often not prioritized for funding for all the scientific reasons that I mentioned. Which nutrients? How are we going to study this? How can we do clinical trials that are really going to provide the critical evidence base that we need to be convincing. So the key messages that I hope I've managed to deliver today is that we first need to study the mechanism in order to design better intervention studies, which foods, the brain side of mechanism, and this needs to engage all of us, the researchers, clinical and basic, and the food industry. And education on mechanisms underlying the relationship between nutrition and brain health is required to get European citizens choosing healthier food. And this message needs to be disseminated. We need policy documents. We need stakeholder dialogue engagement. We need workshops. We need webinars. And the right people need to be there hearing the right message. And finally, future nutrition-based policies for improving brain health need to be evidence-based. I just mentioned the people that are involved in this nutrition network and the brain food, the EBC cluster, and mention especially that we do have a representative from the food industry who's been part of the publications that I mentioned at the beginning, and who has really helped us to develop some of the ideas that I've conveyed today. My emails are here if you would like to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this very comprehensive overview. I see that there is a lot to be done, and I thought at EU level this has been done, but I have the impression that there is a lot to do on the connection between nutrition and brain health, and this also is important in view of what we've seen as an increasing trend of mental health disorders post-pandemic of COVID-19, in fact. So probably this needs also to be much more on the plate of policymakers to take it as a priority within the next or upcoming EU presidencies. I want to mention two things based on your presentation. One, you made a reference to public funding, assuming that at EU level there is large public funding from EU countries, but then looking at how the financial situation of those countries is going in terms of indebtedness, high level of debt, and high level of social challenges. Don't you think this is the time also for the private sector to be part of the solution and not just be contributing to the problem? See, this is my first question. My second question is, yes, I agree about the importance of nutrients, and this is, of course, one key issue. But what about the overall agricultural system? I mean, and this is what Felice has also mentioned it in the chat. So what about the phytochemicals that are really interfering with the overall agricultural systems? And my last point is, I think all this topic is taken from a silo point of view, and we need to have a more integrated point of view to solve all these problems. Do you see this happening at EU level? Please.
You know, there's just so much more that can be done. I mean, you know, our efforts are quite focused on actually the nutrients and the diet themselves, but an integrated approach at the EU level and even global level would really be needed for all the reasons that we've heard from the previous speakers. It's not just the nutrients; it's beyond nutrients. The climate, the environment, so many factors. No, I totally agree with your point.
Thank you very much. Now move to the discussion from Michael Berg, Mohammed Salama, and William Heinz. So I would like to start with Michael. We heard the great discussions. We've been for sure involved in all of this. So please, what is your view and what are the other points that we need to take into consideration in this debate?
Well, I think this is a critically important topic. And I firstly want to congratulate the EMEA on embracing this, because we believe in the mental health field that we need to be focusing on the plastic addressable determinants of health and mental health. And if you look at a population-wide level at all the potentially modifiable determinants of health, right at the top of the list is nutrition. And it influences pretty much every non-communicable disorder that is amongst the major burdens of disability. What was also beautifully highlighted by previous speakers is the extent to which public health has changed in parallel with massive changes in food consumption and the food industry. And I think we need to be looking at public health, public policy solutions for a massive change in the food environment that has led to an explosion of non-communicable disease problems, from mental health to diabetes to food allergy and many others that have been mentioned by our colleagues. So if we believe that it's a massive public health problem, and if we believe that it has to be addressed at the level of public policy, again, I want to congratulate this group, because without engagement of economists, public policy people, the OECD, we are never going to have traction. And I think that we have the beginning of a catalytic process that it has, I hope, the ability to generate change at a national level or at a global level.
Thank you very much, Michael. And do you see a potential for a global action on this? I think at the national level, this could be interesting if there is awareness of the problem. And actually, also, it's important to mention that, and I think also Suzanne mentioned this, that we need to have data, more data, to be able to assess the impact or the relevance of the policy problem.
I think your contention is completely correct. We need to act globally. And in a sense, this meeting is a global meeting. The scientific process is a global process. The mass media and social media are a global process. So I think that everything that we do at one level has global impact. And I think it makes what we do highly leveraged. We also have the big advantage in this area that there are very few areas of scientific endeavor which capture the imagination of the public as much as nutrition does, because everybody eats and everybody's obsessed about food. So I think we really have the opportunity to leverage off this.
Thank you very much, Michael. And also would like to emphasize the role of collaboration between scientists in different fields. And I want to emphasize this point at each level, because in fact, we cannot look at these societal problems from one single discipline standpoint. I think we need to be a little bit more open and having an integrated approach to solve a certain societal challenge from different disciplines perspective. And this is actually why, in my view, the brain capital is a very nice framework or construct, as Harris likes to say it, to allow to integrate different disciplines toward a certain policy objective, and to be integrated directly to economic policy. Thank you very much for this. Mohammed, so what do you think about what you heard, and how would you see all of this in a way implemented in the Arab countries, particularly that you're coming from Egypt, and how do you think in the Arab countries and beyond the Arab countries, in fact, also in Africa, how can this be taken into consideration, and whether you see in these countries particular challenges that we need to take into consideration?
First of all, thanks, Reem, for this rich discussion. Actually, I have two rapid comments. The first is that the more we start studying or focusing on one issue for brain health or health in general, we find ourselves more attracted to what we call a holistic approach. So starting to talking about the gut-brain axis, we all as scientists know that there is a definite link between GIT, the gastrointestinal tract, and the brain in terms of microbiota, in terms of affection of nutrients on brain health. Some diseases are actually claimed to be starting in the stomach, like Parkinson's disease. However, we need to appreciate more is that we have other dimensions. One of the important dimensions are the socioeconomic status and the community level. So in certain places, it's not their choice actually to choose less nutritious food or diet. As we all know that in certain places or in certain low socioeconomic levels, the choice of food is dictated by the low cost, and in most of the time, this low cost is given to a less nutritious or less healthy food. So this will bring the economic aspect and socioeconomic aspect to the table. Another dimension is education, again. So certain categories, I'm here talking about low and mid-income countries like in the Arab world or in Africa as well. The awareness about the value of food and bringing or maintaining brain health is still underestimated. So if we want to address the problem from a multi-dimensional and multidisciplinary levels, we need, as you mentioned, an integrated approach, like bringing social, economic, educational aspects to the table and start addressing the problem as a complex problem. Another comment also is related to the fact that nutrients are not treated as drugs. And this is very serious, actually, because even for regulatory processes, it is different. And we all start to appreciate that food and nutrients and nutrition is a serious issue. So we need to think about revisiting the regulatory processes of food industry overall, and how we are judging the use of food and the food support and nutrition support for patient and healthy persons as well. So I think those points need to be more tackled and traced in the coming period, thinking about the best way to make use of, again, a multi-dimensional, multi-level integrated approach for tackling this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for bringing up the issue of food in the low and low-income countries, where in fact is dictated by low cost. But then sometimes low-cost food doesn't mean that it doesn't have the nutrients. So this is also something that we need to look at very carefully. And also in many African countries and Arab countries, they still preserve certain, I would say, practices in agriculture that I would call them quite much less industrialized, unless there are large companies which are, I would say, moving abroad to produce at a lower cost. And this is also part of what I call the regional integration models that need to be very carefully rethought toward what I call just and much more targeted into quality indicators rather than just enhancing the value for the multinational companies. So this is also another debate that we are making at the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, which is specifically what are the new models of regional integration or partnership with countries in the neighborhood, for example, between Europe and Arab countries, Mediterranean, and Africa as a whole. So this is quite an important point, which go beyond to our discussion today. Thank you very much, Mohammed.
Thank you.
William, what do you think about all of this from your point of view and all the work you have been doing on systemic economic resilience within the OECD? And of course, we have had a lot of discussions already on all of that. And what are those novel economic policy models that have an integrated approach between different disciplines? And this is what you have been pushing forward within the OECD, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the discussion. I think my overarching point is that a lot of the things that we're talking about are symptoms of the way we manage, design, and operate our various socio-economic systems. And I have 3 points. The first point is that cheap food is not cheap. And in Europe, we're realizing that we've relied on cheap defense and security from the United States. We relied on cheap products and value chains from China. We relied on cheap energy and natural gas from Russia. And we're seeing the limits of trying to have access to cheap things. There's lots of externalities and internalities: environmental, health, security, individual, collective. And so I think we do need these broader frameworks to look at all these different implications. And that's why brain health and brain capital is such a useful concept. I think we also have seen in policy making that there's a lot of myopic short-term decision making where things like this, where the costs are spread over a very long period and public health problems, policymakers tend to play for time and just hope that the problem doesn't arise on their watch. So these slow-moving systemic problems are really difficult for policymakers to tackle. And the idea that we just need to set the market price and in a free society people should decide, well, consumer choice is only part of the story. The second point is that optimizing complex food systems makes things unstable. And we've seen lots of examples of this, of value chains being optimized for efficiency, but not proving to be very resilient. We've seen food science rather than food production, again, leading to lots of spillovers. There's lots of scientific, technological uncertainties as to what's safe. And there's also links between domestic agriculture policy and the ability of the world's poor to feed themselves. So all of these things are linked together, and we make poor choices. Like, for example, we want to subsidize corn and other products. So we have high fructose corn syrup and things that get into the food system because of the way we want to intervene. So there's a lot to say about that. And the third is that the solutions often can have unintended consequences. That for an economist, the simple thing is just to correct the market failure. If it is generating all these health problems and mental health issues, then we should just put a price on that. And we should estimate the difference between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost to correct. But as we've seen in other areas, it's actually not that simple to intervene on health-related issues. And for instance, taxes on cigarettes have been looked at. And what we found is that smokers often compensate for tax hikes by essentially extracting more nicotine per cigarette. So the unintended consequence is they smoke cigarettes right down to the end, which is where all the carcinogens tend to be concentrated. So the simple market solution tends to be detrimental to health issues. And the final point is that a lot of the solutions that were talked about included information, advertising, transparency, raising awareness, and dietary recommendations. But the whole issue of food, I think, is interwoven into social systems and can be symptoms of broader problems and broader inequalities. And access to food distribution, healthy, fresh fruit and veg in inner city communities, for example, all of these are broader systemic social problems. And just a final example is the Gilets jaunes in France, when obviously good policy is to put taxes on fuels. But that was seen largely in rural communities as essentially looking at inspections of older vehicles, limiting speed limits, looking at the difficulties that smaller local populations who really depend on cars and tend to be older cars. And it was seen as a policy that was essentially punishing those who were already losing out by the system. So this perception that policies benefiting elites, these can have really unintended implications. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. William, I would like to have the speakers on screen, please. Thank you very much. So you have heard the discussion, and I would like to give you the floor, starting with Suzanne on the discussion points. So what do you think? How can we go forward from here? And then do you think for example, integrated approach and also having a global approach is feasible based on all the societal challenges and the difficulties, and also the multipolarity that we are seeing globally. What do you think?
Well, I can only agree with all of your questions. I can't really say that these are challenges. How do we make them global? How do we gain an integrated approach? It's a great mission, but in practice, who are the actors in all of this, and how big a scale are we going to take it? So, you know, I just totally agree with your questions, and I would ask the same questions. These are really tough challenges that we're going to face in the future. I mean, I focused on Europe just because that's what I'm involved in, but what's true for Europe is true globally, of course. And we've heard from other speakers and discussants, you know, about the need for integration at a very wide level. Environmental issues and all kinds of issues that extend beyond just the nutrition and just the brain. So you know, there are very widespread implications. All I can say is I agree. These are key issues that need to be addressed.
Felice, what do you think?
Thank you, Rim. Thank you. And, you know, I agree with you, Susan, that it's beyond nutrition and nutrients, and it's beyond just the brain. And I think one of the things I would point to is the fact that we're very much in nutritional research moving away from a focus on individual nutrients to recognise that the phytochemicals in plant foods, which number probably around 150,000, and which we've only started to map about a third of those, seem to play an incredibly important role in our health, including our brain health, including the food matrix. And this is the issue when there's just a focus on nutrients. What happens then is industry, including supplement manufacturers, focus on picking out these individual nutrients and putting them in to foods or putting them into supplements. And we know that they just don't work in the same way that they do when they're within the food matrix with all of those phytochemicals. And so, for example, we've just finished a trial where we tested foods that were from a macro and micronutrient perspective equivalent, but whole foods versus the ultra-processed version. And they have a very, very different influence on the gut microbes. So the issue with industry is that they think we can just add nutrients to foods or food supplements and it will all be okay. But we know that that's not the case. So yes, I think we need to work with industry. The World Economic Forum's this new New Frontiers in Nutrition initiative is really looking at how we can shift people's consumer choices to make healthier choices. And part of that, of course, is changing marketing, it's changing availability, it's changing subsidies, these sorts of things. I don't agree that we need to have an explicit knowledge of how particular nutrients influence the brain before we act. I mean, just as an analogy, we don't know how psychiatric drugs work, and yet we still use them because we know that they do work. We know that the precautionary principle would hold that even if we don't have a specific understanding of exactly how particular foods, phytochemicals, nutrients are working, that should not stop us from promoting a move to far healthier whole foods diets when we know that that's going to be globally helpful for every aspect of health, including mental and brain health. And we actually have a very extensive body of evidence now that is very consistent and backed up by the animal data about the importance of food and aspects of food to brain plasticity, to the immune function, to all of these things that influence mental and brain health. And just finally, what I would say is, I think some of the new evidence that's coming out of the agricultural space really points to the fact that there can be cost savings from taking a regenerative farming approach. You can get equivalent yields. You can reduce costs to farmers by reducing the cost of inputs such as pesticides, herbicides, etc. So this can be economically neutral from the point of view of production. But at the consumer point too, We know that industry provides a lot of misinformation about the fact that we need ultra-processed foods because they're cheaper, etc. But those externalities are not reflected in the price. And we also know just from our own modelling that if you promote a healthful diet that includes things such as frozen foods, tinned and dried legumes, tinned fish, that it can actually be less expensive than an ultra-processed food diet. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that are made and that are promoted by industry to as a point of misinformation. And this is where we do need to work with industry to look at how, yes, ultra-processed foods are always going to be a presence and also always going to be needed to get foods to remote locations or in war situations, but we need to completely reframe them to make them health enhancing rather than health degrading. And I think there's a lot to be gained by looking at, for example, the new microbial processes that can really enhance the nutritional value as well as being, able to be shelf stable, etc. So I think there's a lot of promise in working with industry, but I'm also very, very wary that they love to capture this idea and say, but look, this food or this supplement or this, breastfeeding milk product has nutrients added to it, therefore it's equivalent to food. We know that that is just simply not the case.
Harris, what is your point of view on all of this discussion?
Two words come to mind for me, Rim. Accelerate and expand are the words. This whole report came about by Elise and I having a conversation at the end of last year and realizing that there needs to be more engagement in this topic of food, nutrition in the brain in policy circles. And so now here we are from that initial conversation, we have a report with, published by the Baker Institute, which is a prominent think tank with, many co-authors from around the world from different institutions. So we have this catalyst now. So what do we do? What do we do to accelerate this work? It's wonderful that Felice is sitting on this World Economic Forum group. But how do we further accelerate it to other policy outlets like, say, COP28 coming up in Dubai at the end of the year, which is all about sustainability and climate? Could we showcase this reported thinking there and present our latest data at COP? How do we engage better with the World Health Organization, with other parts of the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera? So I think accelerating this is important because we're clearly onto something. And I guess if anyone that's listening to this today is interested and has ideas, please let us know. And that's part of the expansion as well. So not just, how do we expand this beyond the already wonderful group of organizations that we have and co-authors? How do we expand to these other think tanks and international organizations to try to achieve change? So that's what comes to my mind, is that we let us not waste this energy and vigor and motivation and momentum that we have now. Let's work out what to do with it, how to harness it. And then frankly, maybe the last point is there needs to be some organization that's dedicated to this particular topic that can keep auguring in on this. It's so important. So we need a sort of a small think tank or something that can really pay attention to this and cultivate a global network to try to address it. That's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Harris. And I would like to emphasize also the role of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I think they might have, or they need to have a bigger role on all of this. I do not know what they are doing in this topic. Perhaps we should involve them in the whole debate of the brain health and connection with nutrition and food in general, but also the WHO and these connections, so integration between the different global organizations. In my view, there should be much more collaboration, coordination on overall societal challenges, and this, in my view, we don't see much so far. I think there should be much more push for more connection between these organizations on specific topics. You mentioned the COP28 next year. This year it will be in the United Emirates Arab. Last year we have been collaborating in there on the Mediterranean Pavilion. But I must say that these international fora, they fall short in really having actions at a global level because of this multipolarity that I mentioned. So not all the countries, not all the regions are committed to the same objectives with the same timeline. And I think this is also what makes all of these very difficult to achieve a real impact and a real result. And I would go back to what Michael said, science is global. Perhaps we need to leverage much more on science and try to see where science could really make an impact. But again, still the policy sphere need to be active in this, and also the private sector. And I go back to say that nowadays there won't be solutions without collaboration, partnership between the science, private sector, and the public sphere, public policy. And then we need to move as fast as possible. I see the time almost up. So thank you very, very much for this great discussion. It will continue. I also see some questions, but then it's all about, of course, education, finance, but these are all aspects that we need to continue looking at. For sure, this is our first gathering on the topic. We will continue within the framework of brain capital and beyond. So thank you very much, Harris, Felice, Suzanne, Michael, Mohammed, and William, for very, very nice discussion, and hope to see you in our upcoming events and discussions on this topic and further topics. And I would like to thank all the organization committee who has been involved since this morning, 8 o'clock, and all the participants to this webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.